Well, look at here. It looks like it's 7 o'clock. Shall we get this show on the road?
You ready for the screen?
I'm ready for the screen.
All right. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. Welcome to the August virtual show table meeting. We want to welcome all our members, including our newest member, Brandon Sylvester. I didn't see Patrick on here, so I don't know if we'll get to meet him tonight, but Brandon came to the last meeting and we're very excited to have him with us tonight. And so with that, I think we will turn the meeting over to the good Dr. Courtney Hackney.
Do we have any news, Sue?
We do have some news. I have that at the end, unless there's something special you want to talk about.
No, as long as one of us remembers.
Oh no, it's the last screen. We can't forget.
Okay. So we're ready.
We're ready.
Okay, it's always fun to get people's photos, and I keep wondering each time we do this whether I would get to see all these plants in real life if we were still doing this with our meetings. I suspect yes and no, because some of these would definitely be hard to get places. But it is fun to have time to put them all into some order and context. And it's neat to have so many people growing bulbophyllums. I think the first 3 slides we have are all bulbophyllums of different kinds. This first one is Bulbophyllum vaginatum. This is Linda's. Just a really unusual thing, but once you get to know bulbophyllums and just look at how the inflorescence is arranged, you'll recognize they fall into different groups. Some have lots of flowers all clumped together, like the one you see here. Others are single flowers, and still others are arranged in what we call a daisy chain, and you'll get to see that in a minute. But beautifully grown, and as I keep telling people, the secret for bulbophyllums is they like to be wet and they like to have good water. If you can do those 2 things, you can grow bulbos. If you overwater plants all the time, then switch to bulbos, because it's pretty hard to overwater them. Okay, next slide. This is Leslie's. This is Bulbophyllum plumatum. You can see a couple of things here. See how the inflorescence is arranged and each flower hangs down. Notice the real shallow basket that she's growing in. That's another hallmark of good bulbo growers. They usually use really short pots or flats. Sometimes this actually just grown on screen with sphagnum on it. But this is a very healthy plant, looking really good, Leslie. I always love going to Leslie's place and seeing all these oddball things. I don't want to ask how it smells. Next slide. For those of you that didn't quite understand that last statement, you should know that bulbophyllums generally do not have pleasant fragrances. And I won't try to describe all the ways they've been described, but the bottom line is don't put your nose right up to a bulbophyllum flower. This is Bulbophyllum daisy chain. This is a hybrid, and this is one of the other really interesting floral arrangements that we see in the bulbos. This is a hybrid between 2 species. This is Steve's plant, and that daisy chain kind of arrangement where the flowers are arranged at the end of what essentially I guess is an umbel. One flower right next to the other in this perfectly semicircled arrangement is a hallmark of certain kinds of bulbophyllums. And let me just say, there are lots and lots and lots of bulbophyllums. I think it's the largest group of orchids, group within the orchid family. Okay, next. I love seeing these old-fashioned whites, and I call them old-fashioned just because of how old they are. This was something that was done in the 50s, especially, but in the 60s, when cut flowers were really big. There were some wonderful white hybrids that produced very large flowers, and they were highly coveted, but there were a lot of people who didn't want huge flowers in a corsage. They wanted something smaller. And so what was done was to cross a large flowered white with something smaller like Cattleya intermedia. And you produced something very similar to this. Open flowers, but very clear white. And notice there's virtually no yellow in this the lip of this flower. And that's one of the things that is pretty unusual about the flower. Most whites have some yellow in the lip. That's a characteristic of the albiforms of the unifoliate species. But this is Linda's too. This cross, I think, goes back into the 60s. And the Helen P. Dane actually is a hybrid that predates the great round hybrids that came from England that were the first really big whites that got lots of awards. Next. I thought this was a really interesting hybrid, Memoria Marge Steele. This is Sheila Nathanson's plant, and it's an unusual combination. Brassavola digbyana is a green that is super, super dominant in terms of shape and lip, and it almost disappears with Cattleya lovenot. Cattleya lovenot's a primary hybrid and is in a lot of miniatures, typically having bright, bright colors. And you can see the color still comes through in this despite Brassavola or Rhyncholalia digbyana in the background. I always talk about digbyana producing the big frilly lips. You see there's a beautiful lip, and that's coming from the digbyana, but it is not nearly as frilly as we're used to seeing when digbyana is a parent. But beautiful color on this. Mm-hmm. Next. This is really RLC. In other words, it's got a number of different genera involved in the parent. This is Jersey Summer. And Dream Circle is one of the parents. And it is essentially the legacy of a famous hybridizer who produced that original plant. And I want to say that most of them have bright colors that are bred from Circle of Life, which is a parent of Dream Circle. But the color can vary from dark purple to reds especially. And typically they're somewhat smaller, which is what an awful lot of people who grow on windowsills are looking for. I will say if you have any of these hybrids that have Circle of Life in it, they tend to like a little bit lower light and they like a little more water. They're not grown like a typical standard Cattleya. There are plenty of them out there, and again, they're almost all very, very colorful. This is Walter's plant. Next. Cattleya intermedia is one of those species that doesn't get the credit that it really deserves. The photo on the top is intermedia variety orlata, and that simply refers to the way in which the color rolls around the lip and the very large column that sets off the flower. It probably has as many different color varieties as Laelia purpurata. This is one that is more the standard background color, but the super, super beautiful lip. And it's a really nice one. This is Suzanne's, and you can see more flowers coming there below. The nice thing about intermedias is one, they tend to bloom probably starting in April, and they'll typically bloom through the summer. Different clones bloom at different times. But the other thing I love about them is they grow really fast, often producing branches so that you may have 2 flowers that last 3 weeks, but then right after that, you'll have another 1 or 2 flowers that'll last another 3 or 4 weeks. It's not uncommon to have a large plant that'll be in bloom all summer, not always the same flowers, but in bloom for a long time. The photo below is Syncomedia. I'm pretty sure that came from Ben Oliveros because I had some that I brought with me to a meeting one time when I was speaking. And you can see it's a combination of intermedia, which is above, and then Syncorana, which is a really small, we used to call it Laelia syncorana. I guess it's considered a Cattleya now. And you can see the plant below, how tiny that is. Syncomedia tends to come, in this case, this is really a cerulean. In other words, it's got that bluish color. And this particular Grex, meaning the seedlings that came from one cross, has bloomed with splashes, solid colors, and everything in between. Very, very nicely done, Bob and Vaughn. Next. I can't get over the number of catasetums that we see almost every month. And so many of our members are growing them. That's the part that's fun. Historically, there'd be 1 or 2 members in a club that would grow them and no one else dared or was successful. But within our club, we have lots of people growing catasetums. And these are 2 beautiful ones. The first one, Donna Wise by Denticulatum, is a more complex hybrid. In other words, it's not just a first generation. But you can see the characteristics that come with these hybrids. The yellow lip is not unusual. It's a common feature of catasetums. And the one on the right is really nice. I love that yellow lip, and I love the spots. One of the parents of this, and for some reason, Terry, I've lost the name now. It's all disappearing.
Fimbriatum with denticulatum.
Yeah, the Fimbriatum, I'm not sure if everyone can see that, but the Fimbriatum is one of my favorite catasetums. It's one of the few catasetums I've grown over the years and tried to keep growing. I won't say that I'm a catasetum grower, otherwise I'd still have it. Next. Stanhopias. Here's another group that you don't see very frequently. And part of that is just because the flowers tend not to last a long time. So having them in bloom, just for the show or a meeting is just unusual because they're not in bloom a long time. But you see here a beautiful one that we might not get a chance to see if we just got an opportunity during the meeting night. That is one nice part about the virtual meetings. This is Stanhopea genesiana, Castorsi. Got an AM, and I can see why, but there are other features for you to see here in these photos. One, look at how it's grown. The real key to flowering Stanhopeas is to make sure that the inflorescence can escape the mass around the growths, because it has to typically grow down. So if it's in a standard pot, you'll probably never see the flowers even though you've had them. And other feature here you can see is, notice there's another inflorescence coming. So even though the flowers may not last long, they'll have multiple inflorescences sort of repeated after one another, particularly when the plant gets very large. I love the fact that this particular plant is being grown in this wire basket. It's a real simple way to mount one. And you'll notice there's not a super lot of medium in there either, but there has to be enough for some moisture, and then there has to be enough drainage for them to drain fairly frequently. When you see these growing in the wild, it's pretty amazing sometimes how little there is around the plant, even though it's growing and flowering super well. Next. Again, another example of a way to grow Stanhopeas. This is Inodora. This is Tom and Dottie's plant. Again, beautiful flowers. As I recall, this is a pretty big flower for Stanhopeas. Is that right, Sue? Do you have some of these?
Yeah, it's big, and it tends to bloom sort of all at the same time. So it puts on a pretty spectacular show.
And that's really nice. And notice in this case, it's one of the mesh baskets that's got pretty big holes, or spaces, I should say. And inflorescences can get out pretty easily. I can see 2 inflorescences. There may be another one hiding in the background, but Tom and Dottie are doing a great job on this one. Is this being grown outside, Tom?
I think Tom had a little bit of trouble connecting, so we're still trying to work our way through that.
Okay.
But I think, yes, he does grow outside.
I was thinking he did. They love this time of year to be outside. These kind of rains we're getting where they're just really soaked and then dry out the next day with a good dose of heat. This will sound a perfect weather for many of the species and a lot of the hybrids too.
They're blooming like crazy this year.
Yeah, this seems to be a good year for them, doesn't it? Stanhopea ruckeri. Wow. Another gorgeous thing. I can't quite see how that's going, but it looks like it's in a basket coming out. And one thing you notice here is the Spanish moss. I find that a lot of plants that we mount or that we grow outside, like Vandaceous things, they really do like, particularly when you're getting them established, to have some Spanish moss around them. I think it holds a little more moisture for them and allows them to get going. But once they get going, they don't mind having the Spanish moss around them even then. The only downside is it can tangle up the flowers. So you just have to be careful when you see those spikes coming out.
And sometimes if it's a scale-prone thing, you can get scale on the Spanish moss too.
Yeah, scale can get on just about anything, except maybe not people, but it gets on just about any plant out there that you've got. And that's the one thing about having plants outside. Remember, they're around lots of other plants, maybe not touching them, but scale is pretty insidious in terms of getting from place to place. It just literally blown off leaves and can land on your flowers and on your plant.
Yeah.
Next. Brassicatlia South Miami. These are two really fascinating photos because what we have is Brassavola nodosa crossed with two what are considered different species, Harrisoniana and Latiguezii. And at one time, these were considered two different forms of the same species. And you'll notice that one of them has a lot of yellow in the lip, and the other one, which is the Harrisoniana cross, does not. South Miami and North Miami. I thought it was interesting how they named the two.
I think Alan did that just because. I think that was a little bit of humor on his part.
I love it.
Yeah.
And it was tempting when I first saw it to think, oh yeah, it's the Latiguezii that produces the yellow. But if you go back and look at other hybrids with both of these species, Latiguezii and Harrisoniana, you'll see that it's got more to do with the individual clone than the species. Some of the hybrids with Latiguezii will produce a lot of yellow in the lip and throat, while others do not. And it's just a characteristic of the individual plant, not the species. Next. Well, Sue, I had not seen the cross that you've got there, the Star Ruby, in a long, long time. It's one that used to be really everywhere and was really interesting because of one of the parents. This is a nodosa hybrid with a cross called Baddeleinii, and Baddeleinii is bicolor by intermedia. So we've seen Cattleya intermedia, and bicolor is a pretty big flower, but the intermedia that they used to make the original Baddeleinii was a splash. And some of the Star Rubies had touches of splash, but they never grew very well. It was the ones that did not, that had this beautiful lip and this particular color, that were the ones that were cloned and became very, very available. They're beautiful. I'm surprised that no one has cloned it again because it's a wonderful thing to have, easy growing, and will make a really nice large plant. It can be covered with flowers. You ever counted flowers on that, Sue?
No, I ran out of toes.
Up above is Brassicatlia nocornpathorni, silk.
You can pronounce that, Courtney.
Well, I'm not sure I did, but I gave it a shot. But what's really interesting about this is that this has binosa, crossed back to nodosa. So this is actually a back cross. So bicolor binodosa makes binosa. And bicolor is also in the other one on the page. But fascinatingly, the flowers look almost exactly the same as binosa. Mm-hmm. And there are some who might argue that this is not a actual cross, that this is binosa. But because of the dominance of nodosa, it doesn't surprise me that it doesn't look that different from the binosa. But it's a beautiful thing, and it's got pretty good flower count, suggesting that this is a legitimate, this is the name of the cross as it's listed there. This is Janus's. Bicolor and nodosa make good parents, no matter what they're crossed with. Mm-hmm. Next. Here we have more nodosa. We've had a lot of nodosa plants in our show table, I think all summer. Brassalalia yellowbird is one of the most beautiful nodosa hybrids out there. Richard Mueller is a nodosa crossed with one of the small, what we used to call rupicolous lalias that is red or orange. But in the background is yellow. So Richard Mueller is a yellow with a beautiful lip, very similar to the plant you see in the bottom slide there. But when you cross it back to nodosa, that heavy coloring just seems to disappear. But what comes, why it's such a good cross, is really high flower count. I used to have one of these for years, and it wasn't uncommon to have 40 or 50 flowers on the plant all summer long, grown in a basket, not much bigger than you see there. And the thing I really like about this hybrid is that people have made this over and over again, so it continues to be available. So if you see yellowbird out there, small plant, big plant, whatever, and you like nodosa hybrids, this is a nice one to have. They're easy to grow inside or outside, and they're very, very rewarding. Now below is Haiku Dawn. This is Richard Mueller by Goldenzell. And Goldenzell is a large flowered cattleya, standard unifoliate type cattleya, crossed with Richard Mueller. So envision something similar to what you see there in the yellowbird, crossed with this big yellow cattleya, and you get Haiku Dawn. This is an awarded clone. Really a nice flower. I'm not sure how big it is, but I'm guessing it's pretty decent size just looking at the flower. And that lip is reminiscent of Richard Mueller and Richard Mueller hybrids. A nice, nice flower. It'd be interesting to see how many flowers on a stem this will get as it gets bigger, Linda. Next slide. Jiminy Cricket by Rhyncholalia glauca. This is Rhynchovola Fairy Queen. And you can see in this particular cross, pretty much all of the parents that are in the background. The glauca is coming out in that lip with the heavy, I'm guaranteeing it's a pretty heavy lip. Jiminy Cricket, I think, is nodosa by Digbyana, as I remember. And you can see the color coming in the sepals and petals. That's not unusual for something bred with either Digbyana or glauca. Most of the clones that are used to breed aren't pure albas. They have this little bit of a blush in the background, but really pretty. I love it, Alan. It's a nice, nice thing to have. Growing in a basket. Next. Dendrobium blue spin. And I tell people all the time that it's important to know the parentage of plants so you know how to grow them. That's particularly true with dendrobiums because they come from so many different habitats. And even hybrids can often be recognized by the flower form as to what group they belong to. And blue spin apparently is not a registered hybrid. And this is becoming an issue that we're seeing with a number of things coming, particularly from Taiwan, where the breeders do not want anyone to know what they use to make it. And so they don't register it with the RHS. They give it a name and they know what it is, but they're not going to tell you. In this case, this is fairly easy to grow, standard form of dendrobium, and looks like somebody's got it mounted in a, can't quite tell if that's plastic or metal, but it looks like it's doing pretty darn well growing like this. Beautiful color. It's just a shame it's not registered. And if they're not registered, you can't enter them into shows either, even though they're beautiful. Next. Dendrobium hibiki, tiny bubbles. This has got an FCC. When I first saw it, I was a little surprised to see the FCC. But when I looked at it more closely and looked it up, it's got all the characteristics, the best of the characteristics of both of these parents. And in fact, this particular hybrid has garnered lots and lots of awards, despite the fact that it's not really an old hybrid. You can see in this particular hybrid. The parents basically will bloom off the old growths, and it's also got plenty of new leaves coming at the same time. There are some of the dendrobiums that you won't see any green leaves when they're blooming, but this one is a different beast in that it'll have both. But Leslie, you're doing a great job, of course, growing this thing.
Courtney, I bet that thing is in bloom for 2 or 3 months at a time.
That's what I've been told, and that probably explains why there's so many awards.
Good
You know,
point.
it's something we don't think about when we think about awards. We think about the flower quality, what the color is, how big it is, how pretty it is, etc. But the fact is that if they're only in bloom for a couple days a year, the chance of getting it to a judging center or a show at exactly the right time is really limited compared to something that stays in bloom longer. And that may explain why there's so many awards to this particular hybrid. Okay, next. I had to spend some time looking up this particular one on the top, the Macali, which is Maculatum by Sarcodes. This is Penny's plant. Because when I remembered the Sarcodes, I thought I remembered it having very large petals, which in fact it does. But what it brings to the particular hybrid, I think, is a size increase in the flowers. And you can see they're pretty large flowers, well spaced on an inflorescence, beautiful yellow, what I would call an oncidium or intergeneric type of oncidium. Looks like it's a very nicely grown plant. Below is Oncidium yellow macrae. Here's another example of an oncidium or an orchid that's not registered with the Royal Horticultural Society. And it's really unfortunate. That is really beautiful. And we could probably guess what some of the parents are, but unfortunately we couldn't have it in a show, or it couldn't be exhibited in a show, but it's still a beautiful, beautiful thing. I can't quite tell where the flowers are coming from. It almost looks like there's a couple of pots of it. Janice, so you got a bunch of pots of this?
I've got 2 pots. Those branches are just from one plant.
Oh, wow.
There's like
Yep.
three of them, and they're totally full.
Well, you can see why this was cloned.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing. And again, we're seeing more of this coming from Taiwan, of them, can't believe they're not willing to spend the $14 to register it, but I think it's got more to do with not letting anyone else know what they use to make the hybrid.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, next. This was interesting. Psychopsis Mendenhall variety Hildos. And what we've got here is it actually having 2 flowers at the same time. And that's not usual. I mean, this is Butterfly by Papilio, and Butterfly is a hybrid of Papilio by Sandere. So this is basically a back cross. And I've seen a number of these in bloom. Carter and Holmes used to have lots and lots of them. They may still have, but every time you see them, they're striking, particularly because of just the shape and form. We call it a butterfly orchid sometimes. It goes by a lot of different names. It used to be called an oncidium, but now we know it's a totally different group and actually does not breed with oncidiums at all. It's just a totally separate group. And I say this each time someone brings these in: when the flower drops off, don't cut off the inflorescence, because it'll keep blooming for years on that same inflorescence. And it's not uncommon to see in shows a single plant that'll have 10 inflorescences, some of which are probably 8 or 10 years old, that just keep blooming and blooming and blooming. I'm not sure how long the inflorescence will actually keep going, but it's many years. Next. This is a pretty famous cerulean, Mary Elizabeth Bond variety Royal Flare. In my memory, when I've seen this in shows, it's got an intensity. That darker cerulean you see is more of an indigo color than the typical cerulean. And then the flower itself is a more typical cerulean color. It's always striking. This is Blue Boy by Beringiana. Blue Boy is a very famous hybrid bred by B.O. Bracey in California many years ago that brings into the mix of ceruleas some different species. And Beringiana is a famous parent of ceruleas. And you see almost the best of both worlds in this. This is still available as a mare clone. I've seen this fairly recently. And this particular clone is one of the best of the whole group. There are a couple other clones out there that are nice, but I think this is probably the best one. At least it's got the most intense color. That indigo color on the petals is very, very beautiful. This is Steve's plant. Next, summer spots. I'm not a great fan of spots. Let me put it this way. I like spots, but they can take over your greenhouse if you're not careful, because many of them are very large. And once you start getting them, it's easy to get attracted to them. And also, they're usually incredibly fragrant in a good way, not like a bulbophyllum. The Cattleya Lulu Hot Pink is one that I've seen a couple of times. It's a known clone and a very valuable clone to have, just because it's fairly easy to grow. Brabrantier is a primary hybrid, and Penny Carudo is a complex hybrid. And you'll see that Penny Carudo is in a lot of hybrids. But when they rearranged basically the different genera and changed some of the names, they confused what a Penny Carudo was. So there are two different groups. One group of Penny Carudos have a flare and the other group do not. And they're distinctly different when it comes to breeding. So here you see a really interesting one. This is Lulu. I like this a lot. I've actually got some hybrids of it. It's a good parent as well. It's pretty productive for a spot. Most spots don't have lots and lots of flowers. Most of them are 2 or 3 just because of some of the parents in the background. But here you see Lulu that has a lot of spots. The one on the right is one of my favorites because if you look in Orchid Wiz and look at the different flowers produced by this cross, you'll see what Penny Carudo can do. There are flares, there are yellows, there are pinks, there are spots everywhere. And I like the background. This is my plant. I like the background. The yellow backgrounds with the red spots is sort of an unusual thing. Most of all, the flower count continues to amaze me. It's not uncommon to have 6 or 7 flowers on a stem of this particular plant. And this is just a seedling I got just to see what it would do. It's been in bloom in my greenhouse, gosh, for probably 2 months. This inflorescence is now dropped, but it's got another inflorescence, and it had an inflorescence before this one. So that is something that spots will do if you select carefully. Just depends on whether you want lots of spots, lots of flowers, or smaller numbers of flowers that are big with these beautiful spots. But this is a distinctly different line of breeding in Cattleyas. One that I like, and an awful lot of people do too, based on the number of hybrids made for spots. Okay, next. When I saw this, I wondered, who the heck has this thing? This is spectacular. This is Cattleya iris, variety patina. All the Cattleya irises I've ever seen were very different than this one in the color. The color would be a mix of yellow and lavender, beautiful things, but nothing like this pure color in Steve's plant. I had to go and look this thing up. The original cross of this was made in 1901. So this is a cross that was made in the very, very beginning. Cattleya bicolor by Cattleya Dalliana. It's fascinating just to look at what has come using this. There have been 105 F1 crosses. In other words, somebody took this and made a cross with it. But if you look at all of the orchid crosses out there that have this in it, it's over 11,500 out there. So you get the idea when you hear those numbers that early hybridizers and even hybridizers today think that this is a pivotal plant in the background of Cattleya hybridizing. And it is. but it also has a legacy that is still argued about. Many yellow callias, when you breed them, this was particularly true in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. Many of them would bloom beautifully the first time, and then the next time, the flowers would be a little crippled. Sometimes the column would be a little misshapen, and often by the time it had bloomed the fourth or fifth time, all you had was just a gnarl of tissue at the end of the stem. No real recognizable flower. And people have argued for years over whether that characteristic came from bicolor or Dowiana. But one thing is for sure, it comes into these yellow hybrid lines through Cattleya iris. So that was really a neat thing to see.
Oh,
And
wow.
thanks for bringing that, Steve. That's a beautiful, beautiful clone. When I saw it, I thought, I wonder if he's used the pollen, because it is just such a nice clone. You just wonder what it would do in a modern hybrid. And that is something that we're seeing more and more, people going back and remaking some of these old hybrids that were made some of them in the 19th century, others in the early 20th century, using superior parents than they had in those days.
Mm.
Beautiful. Next. Cattleya Alencondo. The plan there on the upper left is my clone. This is the Hackney clone. It was the first one awarded of the Grex. And I had the privilege of visiting Joe Grisaffi when these were just coming into bloom, and got to pick this out of about 30 or 40 that he had in bloom. And the only regret that I have is that I couldn't buy about 20 of them,
Yeah.
because every one was really beautiful and in many different ways. The Hackney clone is a very bronzy clone, and the one on the bottom, that's the rosemary clone. That actually belongs to me. The one on the upper part is Sue Bottom's plant, but I have a piece too. The rosemary
he
clone,
gave it to me.
yeah, it came from me.
Yeah.
I try to give my good plants to somebody who can grow them well. The one on the bottom is the rosemary clone. And if you look kind of carefully, you can see that it's much more in the purple range. And you can look carefully, you'll see a lot of tiny, tiny spots. But it is just like the other clones. It is a tall grower, not uncommon for it to reach 2.5 or 3 feet tall, especially with the inflorescence. It's a summer bloomer, fragrant as can be. And if you've tried growing these big growing things like this that have a lot of Guttata or Leopoldii in them, the only key to growing them is they like bright light and they hate being repotted. When you repot them, do like Sue does. Don't repot them. Just let them run into the next pot. So that's an easy way to not have to repot. And when they finally get established in the next pot, you just cut them off at the time of year where they're getting new growths. And it's not unusual for them to grow 1 or 2 new growths in the old bulbs. So Alencondo, beautiful thing if you can find them. There are, in fact, a bunch of sib crosses out there now that should be blooming pretty soon. So it'll be interesting to see how they look. Next. Maui Plum, Volcano Queen, a very famous clone from Akasuka Orchids in Hawaii. Interestingly enough, it uses Summerlin Girl, which is a clone that I know well that is the parent of Alencondo. So you can see how one particular clone can influence whole lines of breeding. And Maui Plum essentially goes back to a species. And what you do get is lots of flowers. Sue's is in bloom. This is Sue's plant. I've got it in bloom too. But I do remember seeing some that would have 12 or 14 flowers on theirs. I haven't reached that state yet, but it can be done. Notice that to the right is Sagaric Wax, which is Summerlin Girl by Chocolate Drop. And Chocolate Drop's a primary hybrid. This is Bob and Yvonne's clone. It's a beautiful thing, extraordinarily fragrant, and it is in the background of lots and lots of other hybrids of this particular type. I can't see the names on these bottom 2.
That's the Maui Plum with Walden's Glen.
That's right. That's one that Sue got from Ben. And that is one of the best ones I've seen just because of those beautiful wide petals. Many of them tend to have more narrow petals. beautiful, and the color is extraordinarily intense. How about the bottom right? So I can't see that one.
That's another Sadrach wax. That's just the
Okay.
close up of the flower.
I thought maybe it was a hybrid because it looks a lot like Sadrach wax.
Yeah.
Okay, next. Nell Clark, Lynette #1. This cross is a really interesting one because the guittata used to make it was a green, and the ampholis used to make it was a greenish yellow. So you can imagine what Lynette was thinking they were going to get out of this particular cross. They were expecting lots of greens, chartreuses, and yellows. And they didn't get it. They did get one or two. There are a couple of really beautiful Nell Clarks out there that are in that range. But Ken Griffith, who made the cross, and he owned Lynette's, he thought this was his favorite. And so you basically see his pick out of the Grex. And you can see why he picked it. Beautiful flowers with this background blush of color, an intense lip, yellow in the throat, and I'm not sure how many flowers are on this stem, but it looks like there's 5 or 6. That's a nice characteristic. That's coming from the guittata. The size is coming from the ampholis. So beautiful. Every time I see this in bloom, I understand why he thought this was his best. It looks like Leslie's got one over there too. Same cross, I think, huh?
It was. Keith says it reminds him of an Alan Condo on steroids.
Well, it's a little more of a blush type.
Yeah.
Whereas Alan Condo has that waxy kind of a color, and that is coming from the ampholis, which has got interesting parents in the background. Maybe we'll see some of those this fall in bloom. Next. I was taken by the fowl on the left. It's got emerald in it. And emerald is a clone, a hybrid made in France by Vacheron Lecouf. And one of the things that is interesting about that particular clone is some of you may have actually seen this in other crosses, because often it'll have almost a green lip. But if you cross it with the right parents, it essentially produces Phalaenopsis with this intense gold color in the lip. Really, really nice. I love the color on that, and looks like it's getting lots of flowers. I'm not sure what tarragon is bringing to this cross, other than I think it may have some multiflora in it, but looks like it's growing real well. In the upper part, Dorotenopsis Debbie Richard Orchid Affair has Orglades Puff, which is a cross made down in South Florida. I think that was a Jones and Scully cross, but look how big and round this thing is. For a long time, all the breeding for whites was to see how big the flower could get. And they got pretty big. I saw some Phalaenopsis with 6-inch flowers, which is enormous. Overlapping petals and sepals. And the price that was paid for that was fewer flowers and difficulty just having a stem that would hold them. But this is a beautiful clone. And Howard just looks, I can't tell if that's a young plant or maybe a kiki, but that's going to be really even wonderful this next winter. Looks like it's growing really well. Okay, next. Bright Peacock. Here we see a good example of golden peocher. Golden peocher is the one that we were talking about earlier that has this mutation in it that leads to flowers having non-uniform spotting and coloring. But it also has something called Young Ho Princess Gelbleiber. And that has a really interesting species in the background. It's a species that we don't see often called Michelotziae. And it's a small greenish thing. But in many hybrids where you see a flower that's almost green, you'll find it in the background, sometimes 3 or 4 generations away. But it does produce these beautiful greenish colors. They're not in the same color as some of the yellows that have a greenish tinge. these seem to be almost true greens. And it's something we're seeing put into more modern hybrids. Some of the newer hybrids are using the larger flowered summer blooming phals and producing different kinds of color patterns and growth patterns in them, not the standard big whites and big pinks that we're used to. But this is really beautiful. Right, Peacock? Fantastic.
Don't you love it growing on the mount like that?
Yeah, I meant to say something about that because it's one of the things that we don't think about, but often these summer blooming phals will do really well in a pot for a year or two, but they hate being repotted. So if you can get a nice piece of cork or something that will last a long time and get them started, once you get them started, particularly if you get some small plants, hack some sphagnum around it to get the roots started. But once they start growing like you see there, that's when you really get to see how many flowers they can get, the size of the flowers gets bigger, and they can stay on that mount for many, many years. You just need a good mount, something that will last a long time, and they do love cork. Okay, next. Here we have two examples of some of the, what I call summer blooming phals. The Samara variety Cerulean, that's a hybrid between Valina and Violacea. In this case, there's Cerulean or indigo forms. And just look behind the flower and look at those leaves hanging down. Leaves can get pretty large and they have this beautiful sheen. You just have to be real careful about this group because they can rot real fast if we get 3 or 4 days of rain like we're getting now. If you have them outside where they'll just get wet and get water in the crown. Ideally, you have them growing on a mount so that the crown is facing down. Below, Linda's Valina by Mitsuo Princess is a good example of some of the hybrid lines that are being produced. Basically a greenish yellow with a beautiful intense magenta in the center. And I'll guarantee you that both of these are extraordinarily fragrant. Next. I thought we'd see a lot more Ascasendas and Vandas than we did on this particular month. This is Yanisa Gold, Fuchs Gold, Golden Heritage by Anna Gold. And we call these Ascasendas. Now they're all called Vandas. But what we used to call Ascacentrum, which were small flowered, smaller growing Vandas now, when they're added to the mix, the plants don't get as big. They're smaller both in the size of the leaves and especially important is they start blooming as small plants. This looks like in a 4-inch basket and that's not unusual for them to be blooming. Now the nice part is that sometimes you can have one of these small growing Vandas in the background, even several generations, and still get the color and improved flower size when bred to large standard Vandaceous things. So beautiful Lucinda, very nice. Next. Vasca Stylus, Conference Gold. One of the things that I always loved about the Vasca Stylus, and all that means is it's got a Rinca Stylus in the background, which is a different member of the Vandaceous group. For some reason, when you have that in the background, you often see these really brilliant colors and a starkly different colored lip. The other thing I've noticed, and you really can't see it here because the Rinca Stylus is in the background several generations, is that the plants are often very hefty. The leaves are wider and thicker, making them a little harder to grow in terms of just moving them around a greenhouse. But they always reward you when they flower by having these heads of beautiful flowers. I do like the Rinca Stylus things, and this is a really nice one. I can't see whose this is.
That's Leslie's.
Leslie, that's beautiful. Should have known.
Yeah.
Go by the burlap background.
Yeah, I should have recognized it. Okay, next. Kristen Sonia. It's now a Vanda, Vietnamica. And this is Leslie's. I remember when these first came on the scene and they were little tiny plants for $100. And people went crazy for them, not just because of their beauty, but because there was this idea that a lot could be done with this as a parent. And you'll see this in a lot of hybrids now. And it does produce this beautiful color in many of the hybrids. But for me, just the species is really nice. The color is beautiful, clear, greenish yellow, and they grow fairly easily. They're from Vietnam, as the name would suggest, and they like warmth. So ideal Florida plant. Okay, next. A Neophonetia hybrid on the right. This is Nakamotara Peaches by Cristata, and now we call Nakamotara Vanda. The Neophonetia is now considered a Vanda, but if you look at it, it's got a distinct difference in terms of the characteristic of the flower. Always have this long nectary and that characteristic shape in primary hybrids. In this case, this is a secondary hybrid because Peaches is the primary hybrid here. Beautiful. These do like lower light. If you've tried these before and put them up with your big Vandas in the high light, you've probably had some problems with them. They like lower light, so grow them with your Phalaenopsis. They love it. They do like a little more water. They don't like to dry out quite as much, but it depends on the hybrid. So you just have to be a little careful with it when you first get it and see if it likes more water or less water. But this is Edwin Hauserman. Pretty sure I had one of these years ago because I used to get a lot of stuff from Hauserman, and they were some of the first to make these hybrids. Now on the left, Sue, I can't, oh, this is Ascocenda Monachurch.
Yep, Miniata with Ebulacea.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of what I was discussing earlier. This is a primary hybrid between what we now call Vandas, but we used to call Ascocentrum, Miniata and Ampelacea. And you can see the characteristic of this particular group of Vandas that makes them very useful in making hybrids. The plant's blooming is in a small size pot, lots and lots of flowers, really nice color, and what you can't quite see yet. But in another year or two, what you'll see is multiple kikis growing from the base. So where you have one plant producing flowers, you'll have multiple plants producing flowers fairly quickly, and each plant can have multiple inflorescences. So they make specimen plants very fast, and they're still fairly small, given the fact that you have lots and lots of flowers in a very small area. Beautifully done. Can't see who did that one.
That's Linda's. She loves her Neophanetias.
I should have known. This is really an encyclia. Used to be called Epidendrum tampensis, but the hallmark of this is a Florida species. This is Bill Gorley's clone, and I'm not sure that this has a clonal name, and the reason I'm not sure is that, we had a speaker who would come fairly routinely, and when he was closing up shop, getting ready to move, he came with I can't remember if it was a selfing or a sib cross of Tampensis alba. And these were just seedlings in small pots. Almost all of them were in flower. And I've got some of the awarded Tampensis albas that have been around a long time. And half of those seedlings that he brought were superior to the awarded ones. I have one, and I've seen 3 or 4 others that were purchased from that same batch that he brought. And this is a beautiful one. It's hard to see because there are a lot of flowers, but you can see that clear color. These are green with white lips, but depending on how the light is striking them, they can be a chartreuse too. It just depends on exactly how they're grown and on the clone itself. I've got some growing side by side where one is clear green and the other's got that little bit of a yellow color to it, but they're all beautiful. He's growing this in a pot. They do extraordinarily well in baskets or mounted. You can stick them outside. They love it, except for maybe a month or 2 of the year. There are some clones growing around here in the swamps, but I don't recommend you leaving your plant out during the severe winter. Just take it in, but they'll do pretty well for most of the year. The only downside to leaving them outside, and you could see one of my clones that's outside, I have about 30 pods on it because it's a native species and we have pollinators that know what to do with that. So that's a downside if you want to leave them outside, you'll sacrifice a few flowers to the bees so they can have their fun and pollinate. Okay, next. Epidendrum canopsium. So we have two natives. This grows in the swamp right next to my house. Surprisingly, it is not easy to grow. Each time we have a good thunderstorm or a hurricane, I'll pick up branches, this growing on the branches, and I'll stick it close to my greenhouse or even in my greenhouse and watch them slowly die. And part of the issue is they really like good water. And the other thing is they grow in close association with other plants that are growing on the plants. So often you'll see, and here you can see some examples of resurrection ferns growing in amongst them. And they have an association with something in there that makes them not like to be in a pot. Now, what's really interesting is that there is another species that is confused with and may actually be the same one. This is now called Magnoliae. There's also one that we now call Canopsium. Again, looks very much like this. I can't tell them apart. Comes from Mexico. And the Mexican form is much easier to grow. So I know that there are people who've hybridized the two, and they still call them Canopsium, but they really aren't. They're something very different. But if you've got these in trees outside your house, just enjoy them. If you see some on the ground, just stick them up somewhere. Maybe you'll get lucky and they'll grow for you. There are a number of hybrids made with it. Carden Homes used to make hybrids because this particular species grows all the way into southeastern North Carolina. So it's the most cold hardy of all the epiphytic orchids that we know of in the Americas. And whose is this?
That was Lucinda Wynn's.
Okay. Spathoglotis. I often get asked, is this really an orchid? And I think the reason people ask the question is because of the leaves. The leaves look very similar to a lot of palm leaves. They've got the same feel, the same texture. They're very thin. And again, extremely different. These are typically terrestrial, or they grow in terrestrial-like situations where there's a loose mulch on the ground. These have escaped in Hawaii. As you can just imagine, everything escapes in Hawaii. And they're growing along the roadsides now. Not necessarily just this species, but this particular species and other species and even hybrids. So they're becoming naturalized in Hawaii. I can almost see them getting naturalized in South Florida too. Might still be a little too cool here, but it looks like it's growing extraordinarily well with another inflorescence coming there. Yeah. Next. When I saw this, it took my breath away because I remember walking in greenhouses where zygopetalums like this were in bloom. The color that you see is just hard to describe. And as good a photograph as this is, it still doesn't catch the vibrant color that is in that lip. But this one also has nice petals and sepals, pretty flat flower. And I'll guarantee you that this is really fragrant. You can see new growths coming there. These are, people go crazy over zygos down in New Zealand and in southern Australia. They grow well there, as you can just imagine. And they've done hybridizing with zygos with crossed with other things, but I'm not sure they've ever improved on just the native beauty that comes with the species and primary hybrids. Guarantee it's fragrant. And as I remember, there was a little note somewhere here talking about how many flowers were on it from.
This is Walter Mullers. I'll read you what he said. He said, last year we bought a zygo from one of our speakers. It had 2 spikes with 4 or 5 blooms on each. This year he has 6 spikes with a total of 32 blooms. 2 newer and smaller growths are already producing 2 spikes on each plant. So is it the purely organic fertilizer? Does he just have a green thumb? We'll find out next month.
Well, did I do a good job of making sure we plugged the fertilizer, Sue?
Oh, I think you did. That's right.
Well, that photograph does it all. I don't know what more better advertisement one could have than what you see in that particular photograph.
Yeah. we've got a, Jim Young is coming our way in September. So anybody that wants a Pure Leo should get in there, reserve their order.
And it isn't just for orchids. Since we got some of that and started using it in our garden, we get so much production, we actually get tired of eating things out of the garden. It's incredible what it does in just a small space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the last one? Yes.
That's the last one. Thank you, Courtney. You're wonderful as always. And after seeing that zygopetalum, Walter is going to be doing our program in September. He's going to be talking about how he grows his orchids, and I don't think anybody's going to want to miss that. Everybody is familiar with the Phalaenopsis that he brings to the show table, how incredibly well grown they are. So if you want to learn some new tips and tricks, I think Walter will help us along with that. George Hauserman of EFG is going to come up and he'll handle the sales table and the raffle table. So for anybody that is jonesing for new plants, will be good. George will handle that. I think we're going to keep going with the virtual show tables. So by the end of the month, send in pics for next month. I think you're all familiar with the fact that we're moving the repotting clinic over to the church pavilion. It's going to be a little bit of a different scene over there. We're not going to have the supplies and whatnot that we have at ACE, but we will have a whole lot more room. And it's, you know, we'll be undercover. It's a pavilion, there's fans, and we'll be bringing supplies. And so next month, September is probably the September and October are the last months of the year that you can get any last minute repotting in. The plants do not like to be repotted during these hot, humid August months, but in September, when the heat and the humidity mediate, you'll start seeing new green root tips growing. And if you have something that needs to be repotted on an emergency basis or to put fresh mix in, this is the time to do it. So we'll be up there on the first Saturday in September and the first Saturday in October. And probably the best news is that Courtney, if you enjoyed this presentation, Courtney's going to be doing the presentation at the Jacksonville show on the second Tuesday of next month. He's going to be talking about growing and flowering better Cattleyas. The Jacksonville Orchid Society's meeting over at the, oh gosh, Courtney.
It's at the Mandarin Garden Club.
So they've got a new meeting location. Don't go to the Jacksonville Orchid Garden Club anymore. And I don't know, what time does it start over there? It
starts at
7, right?
It starts at 7, and I've already gotten one request from, I guess it was one of our members. I've already sent out a pre-order list to the Jacksonville Orchid Society, but if anyone wants that list, I'm happy to send it to you. Even if you don't come, you're close enough that I'm sure I can get any plants to you that you want from the list.
Courtney, why don't you just send that to me, and I'll send it out to our people.
Okay, that's easy to do, Sue.
Yeah. And with that, we thank you, Courtney. Everybody enjoys. I think if Courtney would be our speaker every month of the year, everybody would just be very happy. I think everybody enjoys it.
Oh, I think you'd really get tired of hearing orchids from me. And if you don't believe me, ask Rose.
Thank you very much, and we enjoyed seeing or being able to talk to everybody anyway.
Good seeing everybody, even if it's virtual.
Yep, even if it's virtual.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Again, Courtney.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.